Okay, I started in a couple minutes before I hit record. So what we're going to do today is we're going to alter a web application, and we're going to use things such as JSON and APIs and JavaScript objects and so on. There are links to discussions of these things in Canvas in week 5. So the JavaScript fetch API is one thing we're going to use, which is a way of doing AJAX, or AJAX is where we make a request to the server and don't get back a complete web page, but get back data. JavaScript's objects and JavaScript object notation, APIs, the author's walkthrough of the weather app, and the weather API by city name, which is what we're going to change the application to do. So let's look at the application that we just downloaded. Okay. Can open up index.html. And first thing it does is it asks us permission. For a web server to know, for JavaScript to know your permission, it has to ask you permission first, because again, that's considered a privacy issue. And therefore you would not want to necessarily always just assume. So it's built into the language that you have to ask for permission. If I answer no, this can't do its job and I just get this error. But I'm going to answer yes. And what it will give us is Sheffield, USA, moderate rain, 18 degrees centigrade. We click on that, it converts to Fahrenheit. And it shows us the little icon of a rainy cloud. So that's based on our current location. Now again, with a mobile device, the current location could be based on the GPS, but on a desktop device, there's other ways of getting the location. All right, so let's look at the code that produces this. Again, we have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to do this. They all work together. We're interested in the HTML and the JavaScript. Okay, our HTML has style. It has a container. Sometimes we use divs or other things like sections or whatever as a container. In other words, it goes around everything. We have our place to put the notification. When we denied permission, that's where the error message appeared. We have our weather icon, which starts off as unknown. We have our temperature in centigrade, which starts off as a dash. Our location. So notice all these start out as empty. So like when we first load the page, starts out with blank, an unknown weather, dashes for degrees, dashes for location, and dashes for weather. When we allow it, then that gets filled in. We're going to refer back to this from time to time because our JavaScript is going to do similar to what we've done in our examples, and that is we're going to create elements, and we're going to update certain locations on the page. Here's our JavaScript. And this is one thing I don't like about this example. It puts the JavaScript at the very end of the HTML document. That essentially serves the same purpose of what I did last week when I said on window on load and then performed a function. All right, because if this is at the very end of the document, then I know that everything on the page is loaded before it got to that. So I know, for example, that all these HTML elements exist. So I can't possibly get an error because an element wasn't defined yet. We accomplished that last week by saying onLoad equals, and then our JavaScript would not kick in until the page has finished loading. This is sort of guarantees the same thing. This isn't horrible, it's just not my preference of the way I do it. So let's see what this JavaScript does. It starts out by finding, using query selector, which is something that we haven't seen before. Query selector is similar to document get element by ID. The only difference is with query selector, we find things based on a CSS query. In other words, .weather dash icon is a CSS item, right? The dot indicates that it's a class. All right. So we're going to look for the thing on the page that has a class of weather icon. And that is this div up here. We're going to look for the paragraph inside of the class temperature value. So here's the item called temperature value with a class of temperature value. Here's the paragraph inside of it. This is simply just a different way of accessing elements on the page. I don't really like this either. The reason I don't like this is classes are not guaranteed to be unique. In other words, I could actually have two things on the page called temperature with the class of temperature.value. And if we were to do that, then this code would break. All right, it probably wouldn't work the way that you would expect it to. But we don't have two things on the page with these names, with these classes, so therefore it's okay. So we find these 5 elements using query select. Does everyone see what I mean? This says find a thing on the page that has, where it says .weather icon, that represents the class. So this will find the thing on the page that has a class of weather icon. This is looking for paragraphs within temperature-value class, which is this right here. Simply a different way of addressing the elements on the page. I probably, if I were doing this, I would use get element by ID instead and just give them all unique IDs. But hey, it's good to see a different way of doing things. You can actually use this to your advantage, like in our spoiler example, if you remember, if we had a show all spoilers, we could find all the things that had the class of spoiler and loop through that list and make them all visible or make them all invisible, depending on what we wanted to do. So there are purposes for using this. Now we're creating a weather object. So our object is called weather, and we start out, we initialize it as just being empty with nothing in it. We'll then use this JavaScript object notation to specify a property of the weather object. So we're saying in the weather object, we want a property called temperature that consists of a unit, which the initial value is Celsius. So it's almost like a tree, like you have in HTML tags. Let's open up Word here. Here's our weather object. Inside the weather object, we have a property called temperature. And that property itself contains other properties. Unit Celsius. So we're building up this weather object to be used later on in the code. So the whole object is called weather. If we wanted the weather temperature unit, we would address it this way. And this is what JavaScript object notation says. If I wanted that unit of Celsius, I would say weather dot temperature dot unit. So if I put that somewhere on the screen, it would put the value of Celsius at that location on the screen. We have a constant of Kelvin. Kelvin is used for, is how the data gets returned to us. Kelvin is often used in scientific measurements of temperature. There's no negative Kelvin degrees, all right? Like you could have negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 20 degrees Celsius. There is no negative Kelvin. Zero in Kelvin is what's called absolute zero, right? And this is a constant because we're going to get the value back from the server in degrees Kelvin. And we want to convert that to Celsius. So we need to know that number. This is an API key. And you can use the one that was created here. You can use the one that the example has. Now, that's just to prove that's like a key that indicates that you're an authorized user of the weather API. There exists on a web server somewhere, openweathermap.org, an API which allows us to make requests and get back data from the server. This makes sure that we're authorized to do that. So most APIs will have an API key associated with it. All right. Now, this is checking to see if our browser supports geolocation. Most all current browsers would support, or all current browsers would support geolocation. This is a feature that's been in the document object model for a while. This is just a precaution that someone isn't running a very, very old browser. So it's looking to see if geolocation is part of the browser. And if so, we do this. If not, we do this. If so, we call the function navigator geolocation get current position and we have here two function names, set position and show where. When we go and try to retrieve the location, first of all, one problem is the browser doesn't support it. That's going to be very rare. Second problem is that the user denied permission. Another possibility is that the web server is down that we're trying to connect to, or we're having internet trouble or something along those lines. So there's two functions that we're going to call. This is what we're going to call if this function is successful. This is what we're going to call if the function isn't successful. So show error just shows the error message, whatever error message we got. That's what appeared when we go here and say block, display the error message. I can't demonstrate that first case of where the browser doesn't support it because all the browsers on this machine support it. If I click allow, however, then we have success. And when we have success, we're going to call the function set position. And that set position function gets the argument of the position. It's returned by the browser, the current position. And we can pull from that position the coordinates for the latitude and the coordinates for the longitude. So when we call this function in JavaScript as part of the DOM, if it works, we call this function and give it the results of that function, the position. We can then pull the latitude and longitude from that. So I could, if I wanted to debug this, I could say console.log latitude console.log longitude. Our console will see the latitude and longitude of the location. So that's the latitude, that's the longitude. Now, the API for the weather application, one of the APIs looks it up by the latitude and longitude. So we're now going to prepare our request to the server, called this getWeather function, and we're going to call that function, give it the latitude and longitude, and this is going to make the request to the server for the weather information. So, getWeather, latitude and longitude. We set our API call to be this. Got the whole thing in. To call a web API, we simply have a web address. HTTP API open weather app org data 2.5 weather latitude equals latitude, longitude equals longitude, and then there's the key. Now I'm going to paste this into the browser. To show you the results we get. So the latitude is replaced by the value of the latitude. That is, if I recall right, 41 point something, 418. The longitude is negative 82,070. This is what the instruction does. It replaces these variables with their values. Two. And finally, our API key. I'll paste it at the end of this. And this is what we get back. This is JSON data. And let's look at it. Let me copy this in the Word. There's the curly brackets around it, which indicate the beginning and end of the data. So if we wanted to refer to, if we get this back and put it in a variable called data, if I say data.coord .long, I'm referring to this value, 82.0707. We use a dot notation. We set the variable data equal to this. Then I can specify coordinates. And then what about the coordinates? I can specify latitude and longitude. Notice how these curly braces go in, and data is comprised of all this data. And this variable coordinate is comprised of this stuff, a pair of data fields. Weather is going to have an array of things in it. Main weather is at its reign. So if I wanted the main weather, I'd say data.weather sub-0 probably .main, and that would give me the value rain. Description would give us moderate rain, and so on down the line. So we fill in this API variable. We make the call, fills in that variable called API, which is the web address of the service that we're calling. We fetch the API, that actually goes and retrieves the data. And we get back a response. Now it says fetch then, all right? We don't do that with most ordinary instructions. We just have, when we write instructions, most of the time, we just have one after the other. Because it does this instruction, and this instruction, and this instruction. We have to do it a little bit different here, though. The difference is this could take a little bit of time to fetch the data from this web server. How long? We don't know. I mean, it's going to be fractions of a second, but we don't know if it's going to be 100th of a second, 1,000th of a second, or what. So we wait until it's done, then we do this. And we're setting our data. to equal the response we get back from the server and convert it into JSON. And we return that data. Then we do the function to set things in our weather object with things from the JSON response data. For example, we're creating a variable in our weather object called weather temperature value. If you remember before, we already had a weather temperature unit. Now we're creating a second attribute, weather temperature value. And we're getting it from the data that we retrieved from the main section, a variable called temp. All right, we look at that. Right here is the main section. I should look at this in Word. Here's the main section, which comprised of a bunch of things. The temp, what it feels like, the minimum, the low temperature for today, the high temperature, what the barometric pressure is, the humidity, and so on down the line. We're pulling from this data, from the main section, the temperature, and that's the current temperature. 291 degrees, boy, that's hot. Well, remember, that's in Kelvin. So we have to take that and subtract 273 from it, and we get then 18 degrees. Other things we pull in a similar fashion. Pull the description from data weather sub-zero. Remember I said that's an array. I recognize the array by these square brackets. Sub-zero is that first element. Description is moderate rain. We pull data, weather sub-zero, that's the first element in the weather list. And we pull the description from it, which is moderate rain. We get the icon, which is also in the weather. And it is 10D. Well, if you look out in the folder for this, we have an icon folder. And if we look, 10D is this guy here. So that's how we get the raining symbol there. We're plucking all these things out of the JSON that we get returned. Finally, we get the city and the country. When that is done, then we display the weather. So we filled up our weather object that we created with temperature unit, temperature value, description, the ID of the icon, the city, and the country. The rest is just stuff that we've done before. We find that the icon, element, and we set the value of the inner HTML to a image where the PNG name is, the name of the PNG is the icon ID from our weather object. Set the inner HTML temperature to temp, set the description to that, set the city and country to that. They do something, a little different than the way I do it. Typically, I do things like Normally I would go plus weather.icon ID. This is just a little neater way of forming it by putting a $sign in front of the curly brackets that have weather icon. That says to put in the value of that variable in this expression. Any questions about this? So, what do you need to do for your assignment? What you need to do in your assignment, first of all, is get rid of everything that relates to the current location. Right? Because we're not doing weather based on the current location. We're doing weather based on the item that we key in. We're going to change this page instead of automatically pulling up the weather of our current location, we're going to have a text box here where you type anything in that you want. So you could type New York, you could type Cleveland, you could type in, you know, whatever city you wanted. So we're going to keep this. We're not interested if there's geolocation, so we can get rid of this. We don't have to call the set position, so we can get rid of this. Our difference is going to be in the API call. In the API call, there's a different URL to call if you're giving it a city name versus latitude and longitude. You know, this is similar to, a lot of things on the web where you can, like Amazon, you can log in using your phone number or your user ID and password or something like that. So we can get the data either by latitude or longitude or by city name. The rest of this is going to remain mostly the same. Now let's look here. This will show us the API to use when we call by a city name. And in our case, it's going to look like this. We're going to drop the city name in there, and we're going to drop the API key in there. Copy the key, put it in. This is what we get back. Same kind of data, we just retrieved it in a different way. So you're going to change that API request. Instead of looking like this, and you're going to make it look like this. All right. Now, what else do you have to change in this? Because there's a little bit, teensy bit more. All right. Add the high and low temperature to the displayed output. Where is the high and low temperature? Well, it's part of main. So we access that the same way we access the temperature, except we pull out temp in and temp max. So we get those two temperatures, the high and the low. And we can display those. And if you click on them, If you click on any of the temperatures, it should convert all the temperatures from centigrade to Fahrenheit or Fahrenheit to centigrade. This might sound really hard, but a key to this is knowing what to get rid of in your code, what to change in the code, and what to add in the code. So this, it's not like you're rewriting this from scratch. The code that you have that you download does, 80% of the functionality, maybe 90% of the functionality. You just have to change it to get rid of anything that relates to location and use a text box to make this kind of API call. To get the data. The data will be in the same place as it was for the other one, and there's two more fields that you need, which are also pretty much in the same place, just slightly different attribute. My suggestion is to go through these things. Again, I can't emphasize enough, this is a high flex class. We only have one lecture a week. You're expected to review these other resources to get a deeper understanding of stuff that maybe I went over quickly. Are there any questions? Okay, that's all I had for today.